Good evening. Tonight, we're going to strip away centuries of romanticization, Hollywood fantasies, and cultural mythology to examine one of history's most misunderstood warrior classes. We're talking about the samurai of feudal Japan, supposedly noble warriors who have captured imaginations worldwide with their honor, their skill, and their legendary devotion to duty. But here's what the movies don't tell you. Being a samurai was absolutely miserable. It was a life defined not by glory, but by terror, not by freedom, but by suffocating obligation, not by heroic battles, but by the constant gnawing fear of dishonor, betrayal, and a violent death that could come from any direction at any moment. Tonight, we're going to explore the brutal reality behind the myth. A world where honor was a prison, loyalty was a death sentence, and where the most celebrated warriors in history lived lives of quiet desperation, always one mistake away from having to slice open their own bellies with a sword. Before we draw our blades and dive into the brutal truth of samurai life, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. Let's see how far this warrior's tale travels across the globe, from those watching with morning coffee to those settling in for a late night. Journey into Japan's darkest historical truths. Picture this: you're 7 years old, and instead of playing with toys or learning to read, you're being handed a real sword and told that from this moment forward, your entire existence revolves around one simple concept: death. Not avoiding death, mind you, but embracing it, preparing for it, and accepting that you may be required to inflict it upon others or yourself at any given moment. This wasn't metaphorical. This wasn't philosophical. This was the daily reality for children born into samurai families during Japan's feudal period, roughly from the 12th to the 19th centuries. The word samurai itself comes from the Japanese verb saburo, which means to serve. And serve they did, but not in the way most people imagine. They served in a system so rigid, so unforgiving, and so psychologically crushing that it turned human beings into walking instruments of violence and political manipulation. They served lords who could betray them on a whim, in a society that could condemn them to death for the smallest breach of etiquette, and under a code of honor so impossible to maintain that failure wasn't just likely, it was inevitable. Let's start with childhood, because that's where the horror truly begins. If you were born into a samurai family, your fate was sealed before you could even speak. There would be no choice in your career, no opportunity to discover your own interests or talents, no chance to forge your own path. You were born to be a weapon, and your training began immediately. By the age of 5, you would already be learning the basics of swordsmanship, not as a hobby or sport, but as a matter of life and death. By 7, you would be expected to demonstrate not just skill with a blade, but the psychological readiness to use it on another human being. The training was brutal beyond modern comprehension. Children were forced to practice sword forms for hours each day until their hands bled and their muscles cramped. They were made to meditate on death, to visualize their own violent end in graphic detail, and to cultivate what was called death consciousness, a state of mind where you were perpetually prepared to die. They were taught to suppress all natural human emotions, fear, compassion, doubt, and replace them with cold, mechanical obedience. But perhaps most disturbing of all, they were required to witness executions, often participating in them by the time they reached adolescence. The practice of tamasigiri, or test cutting, involved using condemned criminals as practice targets. For sword techniques, young samurai would be expected to cleanly decapitate bound prisoners, not out of cruelty, but as a necessary part of their education. Imagine being 12 years old and having your father hand you a razor-sharp katana with the instruction to cut off another human being's head, and understanding that your entire family's honor depended on you doing it without hesitation, without error, and without showing any sign of the revulsion that any normal child would feel. This wasn't an isolated practice. It was standard curriculum. And if you failed, if you showed weakness or humanity, if you hesitated or broke down, you weren't just disappointing your instructors. You were dishonoring your entire bloodline, potentially for generations. The shame of a cowardly son could haunt a samurai family for decades, affecting marriage prospects, political alliances, and social standing in ways that could destroy everyone you loved. The psychological toll of this upbringing cannot be overstated. These children were systematically stripped of their natural empathy and molded into killing machines. But they weren't machines. They were still human beings with human needs and human fears, forced to bury those aspects of themselves so deeply that many never recovered them. The result was a warrior class plagued by what we would now recognize as severe psychological trauma. Men who lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, unable to form normal relationships, unable to experience joy or peace, and haunted by the violence they had witnessed and committed. And this was just the beginning. Because once your basic training was complete, once you had proven your ability to kill without flinching, the real nightmare began. You were ready to enter the world of adult samurai, a world where every single day brought new opportunities for dishonor, betrayal, and death. The foundation of samurai society was the Bushido Code, often romanticized as the way of the warrior, but in reality a set of impossible standards designed to ensure absolute obedience to authority. Bushido wasn't a philosophy of honor in any meaningful sense. It was a control mechanism, a way of ensuring that the warrior class remained completely subservient to their lords while maintaining the illusion that their servitude was somehow noble. The 7 core virtues of Bushido sound admirable on paper: righteousness, courage, benevolence, respect, honesty, honor, and loyalty. But in practice, these virtues were contradictory, impossible to balance, and designed to create internal conflict that could only be resolved through death. Take loyalty. For instance, a samurai was expected to be absolutely loyal to his lord. But what happened when that lord betrayed him? What happened when the lord's commands contradicted righteousness or benevolence? What happened when loyalty to one's lord meant dishonoring one's family or ancestors? These weren't theoretical dilemmas. They were daily realities in a political system characterized by constant shifting alliances, betrayals, and power struggles. During the Sengoku period, roughly 1467 to 1615, Japan was in a state of almost continuous civil war. Lords switched sides regularly, often without warning their own samurai. A warrior could go to sleep loyal to one daimyo and wake up to discover that his master had allied with his former enemies, making him, by extension, a traitor to his previous allies and oaths. The psychological strain of this uncertainty was enormous. Samurai lived in constant fear not just of death in battle, which was almost welcomed as a clean end, but of the kind of political betrayal that would force them to choose between equally dishonorable options. They could remain loyal to a lord who had betrayed their principles, making them complicit in dishonor. They could break their oath of loyalty, making them traitors. Or they could choose death, leaving their families without protection in a world where being masterless, or ronin, was often worse than being dead. The code of Bushido offered only one solution to these impossible dilemmas: Seppuku. Ritual suicide. By disembowelment. This wasn't presented as one option among many. It was the expected, honorable response to any situation that couldn't be resolved while maintaining perfect adherence to the code. Failed in battle, seppuku dishonored your lord. Seppuku made a tactical error that cost lives. Seppuku allowed an enemy to escape. Seppuku showed fear in combat. Seppuku, the list was endless and the message was clear. Death was preferable to any form of imperfection. But seppuku wasn't a quick death. It wasn't a moment of noble sacrifice followed by peaceful rest. It was an agonizing, prolonged ordeal designed to demonstrate the absolute depth of one's commitment to honor. The process began with elaborate ritual preparation that could take hours or even days. The condemned samurai would bathe, dress in white burial clothes, and compose death poems while contemplating the pain to come. He would then kneel before witnesses, take a tonto or short sword, and slowly cut open his own abdomen from left to right, ensuring that the cut was deep enough to penetrate the intestines, but not so deep as to cause immediate death. The goal was to endure this agony for as long as possible, proving one's spiritual strength through the ability to suffer without crying out. Only after demonstrating sufficient endurance would a trusted friend or retainer, acting as kishakunin, end the suffering with a precise sword stroke to the neck. But even this final mercy was fraught with pressure, because an imperfect cut by the kishakunin would add to the dishonor rather than resolving it. Imagine living every day, knowing that this was your expected response to failure. Imagine the psychological weight of understanding that any mistake, any moment of human weakness, any stroke of bad luck could lead to being required to slowly torture yourself to death while others watched and judged your performance. This wasn't a distant threat or an extreme measure reserved for the worst crimes. It was a routine expectation, as normal a part of samurai life as sword practice or morning meditation. The frequency of seppuku during the samurai era is staggering. Historical records document thousands of cases, and those are just the ones considered significant enough to record. For every famous instance of ritual suicide, there were dozens of unremarkable cases where minor infractions or small failures led to samurai cutting open their own bellies in privacy, alone except for their shame and their dedication to a code that valued death over human dignity. But death wasn't the only threat samurai faced. In many ways, the living hell of daily existence was worse than the prospect of an honorable death. Consider the political environment they navigated every single day. Feudal Japan was a snake pit of competing interests, shifting alliances, and deadly court intrigue. A samurai might spend months or years serving a lord faithfully, only to discover that his master had been secretly negotiating with enemies, planning betrayals, or accumulating the kind of debts and obligations that would inevitably lead to conflict. The Onin War, which lasted from 1467 to 1477, perfectly illustrates the impossible position of the samurai class. What began as a succession dispute in the Ashikaga shogunate quickly spiraled into a complex web of constantly changing alliances. Samurai found themselves fighting former allies, protecting former enemies, and watching their lords switch sides so frequently that loyalty became meaningless. Many warriors fought in battles where they couldn't even be sure which side they were supposed to be on, let alone why they were fighting. During this period, it wasn't uncommon for a samurai to face combat against his own relatives, friends from childhood, or former comrades in arms. The code of Bushido offered no guidance for these situations. except the expectation that personal feelings would be completely subordinated to duty. A samurai was expected to kill his own brother without hesitation if ordered to do so, and to do it with perfect technique and emotional control, because anything less would be dishonored. The psychological compartmentalization required for this kind of existence was extraordinary. Samurai had to develop the ability to completely separate their natural human emotions from their actions, to feel love for someone in the morning and be prepared to execute them in the afternoon if circumstances demanded it. This constant suppression of normal human responses created a warrior class that was simultaneously highly disciplined and deeply disturbed. Men who could perform incredible feats of courage and skill while being utterly incapable of normal emotional intimacy or psychological health. The family life of a samurai was another source of constant stress and potential dishonor. Marriage wasn't a matter of personal choice or romantic attraction. It was a political arrangement designed to cement alliances, settle debts, or advance strategic interests. A samurai might find himself married to the daughter of his lord's ally, with the understanding that if the political situation changed, his wife might become a liability or even an enemy agent within his own household. These arranged marriages created households filled with tension and mistrust. Wives were often selected not for compatibility or affection, but for their family connections or potential value as hostages. They might be spies for their father's interests, saboteurs working to undermine their husband's lords, or simply unwilling participants in political arrangements that benefited everyone except the actual people involved in the marriage. Children born into such households faced an even more complex web of conflicting loyalties. They owed obedience to their fathers, but also to their mothers' families. They were expected to honor their paternal lineage, while potentially being groomed by their maternal relatives, to serve different masters or advance competing interests. The result was often children who grew up never knowing who they could trust, never certain whether their own family members were allies or enemies, and always aware that their personal relationships were subordinate to political necessity. The pressure on samurai fathers was particularly intense. They were responsible not just for their own honor, but for the honor of their entire family line, potentially stretching back for generations and forward into an uncertain future. A single mistake could doom their children and grandchildren to lives of shame and reduced social standing. This knowledge created a psychological burden that many found impossible to bear, leading to a culture where fathers were often distant, harsh, and emotionally unavailable, not out of lack of love, but out of the crushing weight of responsibility for their family's fate. The economic realities of samurai life added another layer of stress to an already unbearable existence. Contrary to popular belief, most samurai were not wealthy. The majority lived on modest stipends provided by their lords, stipends that could be reduced, suspended, or eliminated entirely based on political considerations or economic pressures. A samurai family might go from relative comfort to near starvation overnight if their lord fell from favor or faced financial difficulties. This economic uncertainty was made worse by the expectations placed on samurai to maintain appearances. They were required to dress in expensive clothing, maintain elaborate households, and participate in costly ceremonies and social rituals, regardless of their actual financial situation. Many samurai families lived in a state of genteel poverty, desperately trying to maintain the facade of prosperity, while struggling to afford basic necessities. The pressure to maintain a face often forced samurai into humiliating situations. They might be required to borrow money from merchants, a class they were supposed to look down upon, or to sell family heirlooms and weapons to pay for mandatory social obligations. Some resorted to working in trades or crafts, activities that were considered beneath their station but necessary for survival. This created a constant tension between practical necessity and social expectation, another impossible contradiction in a life already full of them. During the later Tokugawa period, when Japan was unified and largely peaceful, many samurai found themselves without any clear purpose. The warrior skills they had trained for their entire lives were no longer needed, but they were still bound by the same code of honor and social expectations. They became, in effect, an obsolete class clinging to outdated traditions while struggling to find meaning in a world that had moved beyond the need for their services. This was, perhaps, the cruelest irony of samurai existence. After centuries of brutal training, psychological conditioning, and personal sacrifice in service of war, many found themselves living in peace, with no outlet for the violence they had been shaped to embody. They were trapped between their warrior identity and a peaceful reality, unable to abandon the code that defined them, but unable to find fulfillment in its practice. The daily routine of a samurai during peacetime was a constant reminder of this purposelessness. They would wake before dawn to practice sword forms that would never be used in actual combat. They would meditate on death and honor while knowing that they would likely die of old age in their beds rather than gloriously in battle. They would maintain their weapons and armor with obsessive care for conflicts that would never come. It was a kind of elaborate performance, a commitment to meaningless ritual that had to be maintained at all costs because it was all that distinguished them from the common people they had been trained to consider beneath them. The psychological toll of this existence was evident in the high rates of depression, alcoholism, and suicide among the samurai class during the Edo period. Many warriors found themselves struggling with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, not from combat, but from a lifetime of psychological conditioning that had prepared them for a world that no longer existed. They were living weapons with no war to fight, trained killers in a peaceful society, bound by codes of honor that had become completely divorced from practical reality. The clothing and appearance requirements alone were a constant source of stress. A samurai was expected to dress according to his station at all times, wearing elaborate and expensive garments that required careful maintenance and frequent replacement. The famous top-knot hairstyle wasn't just a fashion choice. It was a legal requirement, and failure to maintain it properly could result in punishment or social disgrace. Even the way a samurai walked, spoke, and gestured were regulated by social expectations that had to be maintained perfectly in public. The weapons that define the popular image of the samurai were also sources of constant anxiety. The katana wasn't just a tool or symbol, it was a legal requirement and a spiritual responsibility. A samurai who lost his sword faced not just practical difficulties, but profound spiritual crisis. The blade was considered to contain the soul of the warrior, and its care and maintenance were elaborate rituals that consumed hours of each day. The sword had to be cleaned, oiled, and inspected regularly, not just for practical reasons, but as a form of meditation and spiritual discipline. But the sword also represented the constant possibility of violence. In a society where drawing one's blade unnecessarily was a serious crime, but where failing to draw it when honor demanded could be equally serious, samurai lived in a state of constant tension about when and how to use their weapons. They had to develop an almost supernatural ability to read social situations and determine the exact moment when violence was expected, permitted, or required. The legal system that governed samurai behavior was Byzantine in its complexity and merciless in its application. A samurai could be punished not just for his own actions, but for the actions of his family members, servants, or even casual associates. The concept of collective responsibility meant that a warrior might find himself facing execution for crimes committed by people over whom he had no control. This created a paranoid social environment where samurai were constantly monitoring and controlling everyone around them, not out of cruelty, but out of desperate self-preservation. The justice system offered little protection for samurai accused of crimes. Trials were rare, and when they occurred, they were more concerned with maintaining social order than determining actual guilt or innocence. Confession under torture was considered the ideal outcome, and samurai were expected to accept punishment with the same stoic acceptance they brought to all other aspects of their lives. Many chose seppuku rather than face the humiliation of a trial, particularly since the outcome was usually predetermined based on political considerations rather than evidence. The constant presence of death in samurai culture extended far beyond the battlefield or the ritual. Suicide chamber disease, particularly during the frequent epidemics that swept through Japan, was another ever-present threat. But even illness was governed by the code of honor. A samurai was expected to maintain his dignity and continue his duties even while seriously ill, and showing weakness or seeking medical help was often considered shameful. Many warriors died from easily treatable conditions because seeking help would have implied a lack of spiritual strength. The winter months were particularly brutal for samurai families. Heating was expensive and often inadequate. Food supplies could run short, and the physical demands of maintaining warrior conditioning in harsh weather were enormous. Many samurai compounds were built more for defensive purposes than comfort, with thin walls, poor insulation, and minimal amenities. Warriors would spend months in conditions that were barely livable, all while maintaining the pretense that physical discomfort was irrelevant to their spiritual discipline. The travel required for military service or administrative duties was another constant hardship. Roads in feudal Japan were primitive, dangerous, and poorly maintained. A samurai traveling to fulfill his obligations might spend weeks on foot or horseback, sleeping in inadequate shelters, eating poor food, and facing the constant threat of bandits or hostile weather. These journeys were made more dangerous by the requirement to travel in full ceremonial dress and carry valuable weapons, making samurai attractive targets for robbery. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of samurai life was the complete absence of privacy or personal autonomy. Every aspect of a warrior's existence was subject to scrutiny and regulation by superiors, peers, and society in general. A samurai could not choose his own clothing, food, housing, career, spouse, or even his personal beliefs without considering how these choices would reflect on his honor and social standing. This constant surveillance created a culture of paranoia and self-censorship where authentic self-expression was not just discouraged, it was literally impossible. The religious and spiritual expectations placed on samurai added another layer of complexity to their already impossible existence. They were expected to be devout Buddhists, capable of achieving enlightenment through meditation and spiritual discipline, while simultaneously being professional killers whose entire identity was built around violence and aggression. This contradiction created profound spiritual confusion for many warriors, who struggled to reconcile their religious beliefs with their social obligations. Zen Buddhism, which became particularly associated with the samurai class, offered some philosophical framework for dealing with these contradictions, but it also added new pressures and expectations. A samurai was expected to achieve a state of mental emptiness and spiritual detachment while remaining emotionally invested in honor, loyalty, and family obligations. He was supposed to accept the impermanence of all things while desperately clinging to concepts of eternal honor and ancestral duty. These philosophical contradictions were not abstract intellectual exercises. They were practical dilemmas that had to be resolved in daily life, often under extreme pressure and with deadly consequences for wrong choices. The tea ceremony, flower arrangement, poetry composition, and other cultural pursuits that were expected of educated samurai were not relaxing hobbies or artistic outlets. There were additional forms of discipline and social obligation, governed by elaborate rules and subject to constant evaluation by peers and superiors. A poorly composed poem or improperly performed tea ceremony could result in social disgrace and political consequences. Even artistic expression became another arena for potential failure and dishonor. The seasonal festivals and ceremonies that punctuated the samurai calendar were sources of stress rather than celebration. Each event required elaborate preparation, expensive clothing and gifts, and flawless performance of complex rituals. A samurai family might spend months preparing for a single ceremony, dedicating enormous amounts of time and money to ensure that their participation met the impossible standards expected of their class. The festivals themselves were not joyous occasions, but rather formal displays of status and adherence to tradition, where every gesture was scrutinized and every mistake was remembered and discussed. The education system that shaped young samurai was designed to produce not independent thinkers or creative individuals, but perfect copies of an idealized warrior template. Students were expected to memorize vast amounts of classical literature, military strategy, and philosophical texts, but they were not encouraged to question, analyze, or develop their own interpretations of this material. The goal was perfect reproduction of approved thoughts and behaviors, not intellectual growth or personal development. The competitive environment within the samurai class was ruthlessly intense. Warriors were constantly being evaluated and ranked against their peers, with their social status, economic opportunities, and family prospects all dependent on maintaining their position within this hierarchy. This created a culture of paranoia and sabotage where samurai were as likely to be destroyed by their colleagues as by their enemies. Friendships were rare and dangerous, since today's ally could become tomorrow's rival for a coveted position or their lord's favor. The aging process was particularly cruel for members of the warrior class, as physical skills declined with age. Older samurai faced the humiliating prospect of being surpassed by younger warriors, while still being held to the same impossible standards of performance and behavior. Many chose seppuku rather than face the gradual erosion of their abilities and status, preferring death to the shame of acknowledging human limitations. The women in samurai families faced their own unique forms of suffering. Samurai wives were expected to be perfectly disciplined household managers, capable of running complex domestic operations while maintaining the facade of effortless grace and submission. They were responsible for the education and discipline of children, the management of servants, and the maintenance of family honor, all while having no legal rights or social standing independent of their male relatives. These women were also expected to be prepared for violence at any moment. Many were trained in the use of weapons, particularly the naginata, a type of palome. But their training was focused on defending the household or committing suicide rather than engaging in offensive combat. A samurai wife was expected to kill herself and her children rather than allow them to be captured by enemies. And many carried small knives specifically for this purpose. The isolation of samurai families was profound and deliberate. Close relationships with people outside their class were discouraged or forbidden, creating a social environment where warriors and their families were surrounded exclusively by others facing the same impossible pressures and contradictions. This isolation prevented the development of perspective or alternative viewpoints that might have challenged the system or offered emotional relief from its demands. The concept of leisure, as understood by modern people, simply did not exist. For the samurai class, every moment of the day was structured around duty, discipline, or preparation for duty. Even activities that might appear recreational, such as poetry, composition, or garden contemplation, were actually forms of training, designed to develop the mental discipline and cultural knowledge required for their social role. There was no time or space for spontaneous enjoyment, personal exploration, or simple relaxation. The medical understanding of the time meant that samurai lived with constant physical pain and disability from their training and lifestyle. Repeated sword practice caused joint damage, arthritis, and repetitive stress injuries that were accepted as natural consequences of warrior life. Battle wounds were treated with primitive methods that often resulted in permanent disability, chronic pain, or disfigurement. Mental health issues, which must have been endemic given the psychological pressures of samurai life, were not recognized as legitimate medical concerns, but were instead treated as spiritual or character failures. The end of the samurai era, when it finally came in the mid-19th century, was not a liberation but another form of tragedy. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 abolished the feudal system and stripped the samurai of their legal privileges, social status, and economic support. Warriors who had spent their entire lives preparing for a world that no longer existed found themselves adrift in a rapidly modernizing society that had no place for their skills or values. Many former samurai faced poverty, social irrelevance, and cultural displacement. They had sacrificed their humanity to become perfect warriors, only to discover that their perfection was no longer valued or needed. Some attempted to adapt to the new world, becoming businessmen, teachers, or government officials, but many found it impossible to abandon the code that had defined their entire existence. The psychological conditioning that had made them effective warriors made them unable to function in a peaceful, modern society. The final irony of samurai existence was that their greatest success, the unification and pacification of Japan, made them obsolete. The very goals they had worked and died to achieve eliminated the need for their continued existence. They had created a peaceful, ordered society that had no place for professional warriors bound by codes of honor that belonged to a more primitive and violent age. This, then, was the reality of samurai life. A existence so constrained by impossible expectations, so defined by the constant threat of violence and death, so devoid of personal autonomy or genuine human connection, that it represented not the pinnacle of human achievement, but rather one of history's most elaborate forms of psychological and spiritual torture. The samurai were not noble warriors living lives of honor and purpose. They were victims of a social system that transformed human beings into instruments of political control through the systematic destruction of everything that makes life worth living The myth of the noble samurai persists because it serves our need for heroes and our desire to believe that suffering and sacrifice can be transformed into meaning through the application of discipline and honor. But the historical reality tells a different story. One of human beings trapped in an impossible system, struggling to maintain their humanity while being systematically stripped of everything that makes us human. Dignity, autonomy, love, joy, and hope. The samurai were not heroes. They were casualties of one of history's most sophisticated systems of human oppression. Warriors who won every battle except the one that mattered most, the fight to remain human in the face of dehumanizing expectations. Their story is not one of triumph, but of tragedy. A reminder that honor without humanity is not noble, but monstrous, and that the greatest courage is not the willingness to die for abstract principles, but the strength to live as a complete human being in spite of the systems that seek to reduce us to something less in the end. The samurai were destroyed not by foreign invaders or military defeat, but by the very code they served so faithfully. Bushido didn't create noble warriors. It created broken human beings who mistook their brokenness for virtue. The real tragedy is not that the samurai era ended, but that it lasted as long as it did, consuming countless lives in service of ideals that were fundamentally opposed to human flourishing. The lesson of the samurai is not that we should admire their dedication or emulate their discipline, but that we should recognize the warning signs of systems that demand the sacrifice of our humanity in exchange for the illusion of honor. The greatest rebellion against the samurai code is not to die gloriously in its service, but to live fully as a human being with all the messy contradictions, personal desires, and individual autonomy that such a life entails. This is why being a samurai was actually terrible, not because of the physical dangers or hardships, but because it required the systematic elimination of everything that makes life worth living in exchange for a code of honor that was designed not to elevate human beings, but to control them. The samurai were not the masters of their own destiny. They were slaves to an ideology that promised them meaning while delivering only suffering, offered them honor while stealing their humanity, and convinced them that their prison was actually a palace. The real tragedy of the samurai is not how they died, but how they lived, and perhaps more importantly, how they failed to live, constrained by expectations so rigid and contradictory that genuine human existence became impossible. They were warriors who conquered everything except the right to be human, servants of honor who sacrificed the very things that make honor meaningful, and masters of death who never truly learned how to live. But let's dig deeper into the specific mechanisms of this psychological torture, because understanding the details reveals just how sophisticated and cruel this system really was. Consider the morning routine of a typical samurai during the Edo period. He would wake before dawn, not to the gentle stirring of natural sleep cycles, but to the rigid demands of a schedule that had been drilled into him since childhood. There was no snoozing, no gradual awakening, no moment of peaceful transition between sleep and consciousness. The day began with the immediate, jarring awareness that every action from this moment forward would be scrutinized, evaluated, and potentially punished. The first task was ritual purification, not a quick wash, but an elaborate ceremony of cleansing that was simultaneously physical and spiritual. Every movement had to be perfect. Every gesture had to conform to centuries of tradition. And any deviation from the prescribed routine was not just a personal failing, but a reflection on his ancestors, his family, and his Lord. Imagine starting every single day of your life with the knowledge that even how you wash your face could bring shame upon everyone you've ever loved. After purification came the armor ceremony. If he was expected at court or had military duties, or the equally complex ritual of dressing in formal civilian clothes. Each piece of clothing had to be arranged in a specific way. Each fold and crease had to be perfect, and the entire ensemble had to communicate not just his social status, but his spiritual state, his loyalty to his lord, and his adherence to proper form. A samurai's appearance was read like a book by everyone who saw him, and any imperfection in his dress was interpreted as a sign of inner corruption or disloyalty. The breakfast ritual was another minefield of potential disgrace. The food had to be arranged in a specific pattern, eaten in a prescribed order, and consumed with perfect etiquette while maintaining appropriate conversation and demonstrating proper gratitude to his lord, his ancestors, and the Buddhist concept of interconnectedness with all living things. A samurai could not simply eat when hungry or enjoy the taste of his food. Every meal was a performance, a test, and an opportunity for failure. Then came the daily sword practice, hours of repetitive movements that had to be executed with machine-like precision while maintaining the proper mental state of detached awareness. But this wasn't just physical exercise or skill development. Each sword stroke was supposed to be a meditation on death, a spiritual discipline that connected the warrior to the cosmic order while preparing him for the violence that could erupt at any moment. The sword practice wasn't training for hypothetical future combat. It was a daily reminder that death was the most important aspect of life, that the ability to kill and be killed was the only thing that gave existence meaning. After sword practice came calligraphy, poetry, composition, or other cultural pursuits that were mandatory for educated samurai. These weren't creative outlets or personal hobbies. They were additional forms of discipline designed to demonstrate cultural refinement and spiritual development. A poorly brushed character or an inelegant poem could be interpreted as evidence of insufficient discipline or spiritual confusion. Even artistic expression became another arena for judgment and potential failure. The administrative duties that filled the middle of the day were perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of samurai life during peacetime. These men had been trained from childhood to be warriors, to find meaning and identity in combat and the constant possibility of death. Instead, they found themselves shuffling papers, mediating disputes between farmers, collecting taxes, and performing the mundane bureaucratic tasks that actually kept society functioning. The disconnect between their warrior identity and their clerical reality created a profound sense of purposelessness and spiritual confusion. But they couldn't express this frustration or seek alternative forms of meaning. The code demanded that they find honor and satisfaction in whatever duties their lord assigned, regardless of how meaningless or demoralizing those duties might be. A samurai who complained about his assignments or showed lack of enthusiasm for bureaucratic work was demonstrating insufficient loyalty and spiritual discipline. They had to pretend that counting rice stalks was as honorable and meaningful as dying in battle, and many of them actually tried to convince themselves that this was true. The afternoon often brought weapons maintenance, another elaborate ritual that consumed hours of time and enormous amounts of mental energy. The katana and wakizashi had to be dismantled, cleaned, oiled, and reassembled with perfect technique while maintaining the proper spiritual attitude. The condition of a samurai's weapons was considered a direct reflection of his soul, so any sign of rust, wear, or imperfect maintenance was interpreted as evidence of spiritual decay. Many samurais spent more time caring for their swords than they did interacting with their families, because the weapons were considered more important than human relationships. The evening meal was another formal ceremony, often shared with other samurai, and always conducted according to rigid protocols that left no room for spontaneous conversation or genuine human connection. Table talk had to focus on appropriate subjects: philosophical discussions about duty and honor, classical literature, or military strategy. Personal feelings, individual desires, family concerns, or simple human needs were not suitable topics for conversation. Even in the intimacy of shared meals, samurai were performing roles, rather than expressing themselves as human beings. The bedtime routine was as ritualized as every other aspect of samurai life. Prayers had to be said, meditation had to be performed, and the samurai had to prepare mentally for the possibility that he might die during the night, either from assassination, natural disaster, or the sudden call to commit seppuku if he had unknowingly committed some infraction during the day. Sleep was not rest, but another form of spiritual discipline, and dreams were supposed to be controlled and directed toward appropriate subjects like death, duty, and honor. This daily routine, repeated with mechanical precision for decades, created a form of psychological conditioning that was arguably more effective than any modern brainwashing technique. The constant repetition of ritualized behavior, the elimination of personal choice and spontaneous action, and the relentless focus on death and duty, gradually eroded the samurai's sense of individual identity and replaced it with a hollow shell of programmed responses. But the daily routine was just the foundation for even more elaborate forms of psychological control. The seasonal ceremonies and festivals that punctuated the samurai calendar were opportunities for the system to reinforce its hold over every aspect of their lives. The cherry blossom viewing season, for example, wasn't a chance to enjoy natural beauty or celebrate the arrival of spring. It was a mandated meditation on the transience of life and the beauty of death, with samurai required to compose poems comparing the falling blossoms to the ideal of dying young and beautiful in service to their lord. The autumn moon viewing ceremonies were similar exercises in programmed emotional response, with samurai expected to find spiritual meaning in contemplating the impermanence of all things while simultaneously clinging desperately to concepts of eternal honor and ancestral duty. These philosophical contradictions weren't accidental. They were designed to create cognitive dissonance that could only be resolved through complete surrender to the authority of the system. The New Year's celebrations were perhaps the most psychologically manipulative of all the seasonal observances. This was the time when samurai were expected to renew their oaths of loyalty, reflect on their failures and successes of the previous year, and commit themselves to even greater devotion to duty in the coming year. The ceremonies were designed to create intense guilt about any moments of human weakness or personal desire that had occurred during the previous 12 months, while simultaneously demanding renewed dedication to the impossible standards of the Bushido Code. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the seasonal ceremonies was how they co-opted natural human impulses toward celebration, community, and spiritual reflection, and twisted them into instruments of social control. The samurai were not allowed to experience genuine joy, spontaneous celebration, or personal spiritual insight. Every emotion had to be channeled through approved forms and directed toward approved objects. Even their most private spiritual experiences were subject to social regulation and political manipulation. The travel required for various ceremonies and official duties provided no relief from this psychological pressure. When samurai left their home territories, they entered an even more dangerous environment where they were surrounded by potential enemies and allies who might become enemies without warning. Every interaction with strangers was a potential trap. Every conversation was a diplomatic minefield, and every gesture was scrutinized for signs of disrespect or disloyalty. The inns and rest stops along the major roads were notorious for their poor conditions, uncomfortable accommodations, and dangerous clientele. Samurai were expected to maintain their dignity and composure even while sleeping on vermin-infested mats, eating food of questionable quality, and sharing space with merchants, criminals, and other travelers who might be spies or assassins. The code demanded that they show no discomfort, express no complaints, and maintain perfect courtesy even under the most trying circumstances. The weather during these travels was another test of spiritual discipline. Samurai were expected to endure rain, snow, heat, and wind without showing any sign that physical discomfort affected their mental state or spiritual equilibrium. A warrior who appeared bothered by bad weather was demonstrating insufficient control over his physical desires and inadequate spiritual development. Many samurai traveled through blizzards or storms, while maintaining the pretense that they were completely unaffected by conditions that would challenge any normal human being. The bandits and highway robbers who plagued the Japanese road system presented a particularly complex challenge for traveling samurai. On one hand, they were expected to defend themselves and any companions with skill and courage. On the other hand, they were required to avoid unnecessary violence and to show appropriate respect for human life. The decision about when to fight, when to flee, and when to negotiate required split-second judgments that could have lasting consequences for their honor and reputation. Even worse were encounters with ronin, masterless samurai who had fallen from grace and turned to banditry or mercenary work. These meetings forced samurai to confront the possibility of their own future degradation while simultaneously requiring them to maintain their superior social status. Fighting a ronin was both necessary for self-defense and potentially shameful, since it meant acknowledging that fallen samurai could be dangerous enemies rather than objects of pity. The checkpoint system that controlled movement between domains created additional opportunities for humiliation and conflict. Samurai were required to present documents proving their identity and authority to travel, but they were also expected to maintain their dignity and superior social status while submitting to examination by officials who might be their social inferiors. The process required a delicate balance between compliance with authority and maintenance of personal honor that many found impossible to achieve. The lodging arrangements during official travel were another source of stress and potential dishonor. Samurai were often required to stay in accommodations that were beneath their social station, but they couldn't complain about poor conditions without appearing soft or insufficiently disciplined. They might find themselves sharing space with merchants or other commoners, a situation that required them to maintain social distance while showing appropriate courtesy. The sleeping arrangements, food quality, and sanitary conditions of many inns were appalling by any reasonable standard. But samurai were expected to accept whatever was provided with grace and gratitude. The return journey to their home domain was often more psychologically challenging than the outward trip, because it meant facing the judgment of their lord and peers about their conduct while away. Every interaction during their travels might be reported and analyzed. Every decision might be questioned, and every deviation from perfect behavior might be used as evidence of insufficient loyalty or discipline. The homecoming that should have being a relief became another opportunity for examination and potential punishment. The winter months were particularly brutal for samurai families, both physically and psychologically. The heating systems in most samurai residences were inadequate for the harsh Japanese winters, but showing discomfort with cold was considered a sign of spiritual weakness. Families would huddle together in poorly heated rooms while maintaining the pretense that physical comfort was irrelevant to their spiritual development. Children were expected to continue their martial training even in conditions that would challenge adult endurance, and any complaints about the cold were treated as character flaws rather than reasonable. Human responses to the food shortages that often occurred during winter months created additional stress for samurai families. They were expected to maintain their social obligations and ceremonial duties even when facing genuine hunger, and they couldn't show any sign that physical deprivation affected their spiritual state or loyalty to their lord. Many families went hungry while maintaining elaborate facades of prosperity and contentment, spending their limited resources on ceremonial requirements rather than basic necessities. The psychological isolation of winter was perhaps even more damaging than the physical hardships. Families were confined to small spaces for months at a time, but the rigid social hierarchies and emotional constraints of samurai culture prevented the development of genuine intimacy or mutual support. Parents and children, husbands and wives, siblings and extended family members were trapped together physically while remaining emotionally distant, unable to express their fears, frustrations, or simple human needs for companionship and affection. The seasonal depression that affects many people during the dark winter months was compounded for samurai by the additional psychological pressures of their social role. They were expected to maintain perfect emotional equilibrium regardless of external circumstances, so the natural human response to seasonal changes had to be suppressed and hidden. Many samurai struggled with what we would now recognize as severe depression, but they had no acceptable way to acknowledge or address their psychological distress. The spring planting season brought its own unique stresses for samurai involved in agricultural administration. They were responsible for organizing and overseeing the farming activities that supported their domain's economy. But they were also expected to maintain their warrior identity and avoid any activities that might be considered beneath their social station. The contradiction between practical necessity and social expectation created constant tension and opportunities for criticism from both superiors and subordinates. The rice harvest in autumn was another period of intense pressure and potential conflict. Samurai were responsible for collecting taxes and tribute from farming communities, a process that often required them to enforce policies that caused genuine hardship for peasant families. They had to balance their duty to their lord with their supposed commitment to benevolence and protection of the weak. Another impossible contradiction that the Bushido Code offered no way to resolve: the natural disasters that regularly struck Japan, earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, and typhoons, presented samurai with challenges that exposed the fundamental inadequacy of their training and worldview. These events required practical response, rescue work, resource distribution, and community organization. But the Samurai Code provided no guidance for dealing with situations that couldn't be resolved through violence or ritual suicide. Many samurai found themselves completely unprepared for the actual leadership responsibilities that natural disasters demanded. The religious festivals that marked the changing seasons were additional opportunities for the system to reinforce its psychological control over the samurai class. These events were supposed to be celebrations, but they became elaborate performances where every gesture, every expression, and every word was scrutinized for signs of insufficient piety or improper spiritual development. The festivals that should have provided relief from the pressures of daily life instead became additional sources of stress and opportunities for failure. The cherry blossom season, in particular, became a kind of annual psychological torture for the samurai class. They were required to participate in viewing parties where they had to compose poetry about the beauty of the brief blooming period, but the poems had to conform to specific themes about the transience of life and the beauty of dying young in service to one's lord. The natural human response to spring's beauty and renewal had to be channeled into morbid meditations on death and duty. The summer festivals were equally problematic, requiring samurai to participate in community celebrations while maintaining their social distance and superior status. They had to appear approachable and benevolent while never forgetting their role as instruments of authority and potential violence. The balance between community participation and social hierarchy was impossible to maintain, leading to constant tension and misunderstanding. The autumn moon viewing ceremonies required samurai to demonstrate their cultural refinement and spiritual development through appreciation of natural beauty, but their appreciation had to conform to approved aesthetic and philosophical frameworks. They couldn't simply enjoy the beauty of the moonlight or find personal meaning in the changing seasons. Every response had to be filtered through the lens of duty, honor, and service to their lord. Even the most private moments of samurai life were subject to social regulation and potential judgment. The relationship between husband and wife, which should have been a source of intimacy and mutual support, was constrained by the same rigid hierarchies and emotional suppressions that governed all other aspects of samurai society. Husbands were expected to maintain authority and emotional distance even within their own households, while wives were required to show perfect submission and support regardless of their personal feelings or needs. The raising of children became another arena for the demonstration of proper samurai values, rather than an opportunity for natural parental affection and guidance. Parents had to suppress their natural protective instincts and emotional attachments in order to prepare their children for the same impossible existence they had endured. The love that should have been the foundation of family relationships had to be subordinated to the demands of honor, duty, and social expectations. In the end, the samurai were victims of a system so comprehensive and sophisticated in its psychological manipulation that had convinced them their suffering was noble. Their restrictions were freedom, and their emotional death was spiritual enlightenment. They were prisoners who had been taught to love their chains, slaves who believed their servitude was honor, and human beings who had been conditioned to see their humanity as weakness. The tragedy of the samurai is not just that they lived these impossible lives, but that they believed these lives were worth living, that their sacrifice had meaning, and that their suffering served some greater purpose. The real horror of the samurai system was not its cruelty, but its success in making its victims complicit in their own destruction. Grateful for the opportunity to surrender everything that makes life meaningful in exchange for the illusion of honor and the promise of a glorious death. This is why being a samurai was actually terrible, not just because of what they endured, but because they were taught to believe that their endurance was virtue, their suffering was enlightenment, and their psychological destruction was the highest form of human achievement. They were destroyed not by their enemies, but by their ideals, not by their failures, but by their success in living up to impossible standards that no human being should ever be asked to meet. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the samurai system was how it created its own perpetual cycle of trauma and abuse. Each generation of warriors, having been systematically broken and rebuilt according to the code's impossible standards, would then impose the same brutal conditioning on their own. Children, fathers who had never experienced genuine paternal love or emotional security, became the instruments of their sons' psychological destruction, not out of cruelty, but out of a desperate belief that this suffering was necessary, even noble. The samurai father watching his 7-year-old son struggle through his first real sword training, seeing the child's natural fear and revulsion at the violence he was being trained to commit, could not offer comfort or acknowledge that these were normal human responses. Instead, he had to suppress his own paternal instincts and push the child deeper into the same psychological conditioning that had destroyed his own capacity for authentic human connection. The love he felt for his son had to be expressed through the systematic elimination of everything childlike, innocent, and genuinely human in the boy's character. This cycle of inherited trauma meant that each generation of samurai was both victim and perpetrator, simultaneously suffering under the system while ensuring its continuation. They could not break the cycle because doing so would require acknowledging that their own suffering had been meaningless, that their sacrifices had been for nothing, and that the code they had devoted their lives to was fundamentally destructive, rather than noble. The psychological investment in maintaining the system became so complete that questioning it felt like questioning their own identity and the meaning of their existence. The women in samurai families were perhaps the most tragic victims of this cycle. They were expected to raise children according to values that went against every maternal instinct, to prepare their sons for a life of violence and emotional death, while maintaining the facade that this was natural and good. A samurai mother had to teach her daughters to be ready for suicide at any moment, to see their own lives as expendable tools in service of male honor, and to find meaning in complete self-abnegation. The natural protective love of a parent had to be perverted into a tool for perpetuating the system that would ultimately destroy the very children they were trying to protect. The educational system that supported samurai culture was designed to prevent any form of critical thinking that might challenge the fundamental assumptions of the warrior code. Students were taught to memorize and recite classical texts without analysis or interpretation, to accept historical precedents as immutable laws, and to see questioning or innovation as signs of disrespect and spiritual corruption. The goal was not to create intelligent, adaptable leaders, but to produce perfect copies of an idealized warrior template that could never actually exist in reality. This intellectual stunting had profound consequences for Japanese society as a whole. The samurai class, which held most positions of political and administrative authority, was systematically trained to be incapable of adapting to changing circumstances or developing innovative solutions to complex problems. When Japan finally encountered the modern world in the mid-19th century, the rigidity and intellectual limitations of the samurai class became a major obstacle to effective response and adaptation. The economic irrationality of the samurai system was another source of constant stress and eventual collapse. The warrior class consumed enormous resources while producing nothing of practical value during peacetime. They required expensive equipment, elaborate ceremonies, and costly maintenance of their social status, all while being prohibited from engaging in productive economic activity. This created a parasitic relationship with the rest of society that became increasingly unsustainable as Japan developed more complex economic needs. The merchants and artisans, who actually generated wealth and created useful goods, were officially despised by the samurai class. But the warriors were completely dependent on them for survival. This contradiction created a society where the people who contributed the most to general welfare were officially considered the lowest class, while those who contributed the least held all political power and social prestige. The psychological strain of maintaining this obviously irrational hierarchy contributed to the system's eventual collapse. As Japan began to encounter Western technology and ideas, the limitations of samurai culture became increasingly apparent. The rigid thinking, resistance to innovation, and obsession with traditional forms that had been cultivated for centuries made it nearly impossible for the warrior class to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. Many samurai found themselves confronting evidence that their entire worldview was not just outdated, but actively harmful to their society's survival and development. The final decades of the samurai era were marked by a growing sense of irrelevance and purposelessness that many warriors found unbearable. They had sacrificed everything meaningful in their lives in service of a code that was rapidly becoming meaningless. In preparation for a role that no longer existed, and in support of a social system that was clearly failing. The psychological crisis this created was profound and often led to desperate attempts to restore meaning through violence, rebellion, or increasingly elaborate adherence to traditional forms that had lost all practical significance. The Meiji Restoration and the formal abolition of the samurai class was not just a political change, it was a psychological catastrophe for thousands of men who had no identity outside their warrior role. Many former samurai found themselves completely unable to function in a modern society that valued practical skills, economic productivity, and adaptive thinking rather than rigid adherence to traditional codes of honor. The suicide rates among displaced samurai were extraordinarily high, as many chose death rather than face the complete meaninglessness of their previous sacrifices. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the samurai legacy is how their story has been romanticized and mythologized by later generations who were never forced to live under the system's brutal constraints. The very people who were most damaged by the warrior code have been transformed into symbols of honor, discipline, and spiritual achievement by those who have the luxury of admiring their dedication without experiencing its consequences. This romanticization does a profound disservice to the actual human beings who suffered under the samurai system. It transforms their pain into inspiration, their psychological destruction into spiritual achievement, and their victimization into heroism. The real samurai, the men who lived and died under impossible constraints, who sacrificed their humanity for abstract ideals, who were broken by a system that promised them meaning while delivering only suffering, deserve to be remembered not as heroes, but as cautionary examples of what happens when human beings are reduced to instruments of ideology. The modern fascination with samurai culture often focuses on their discipline, their dedication, and their willingness to die for their beliefs, but it ignores the human cost of these qualities. True discipline should enhance human potential, not destroy it. Genuine dedication should be freely chosen, not imposed through psychological conditioning. The willingness to die for one's beliefs is only admirable when those beliefs are worthy of such sacrifice, when they contribute to human flourishing rather than human degradation. The samurai were not masters of their fate, but slaves to an ideology that consumed everything valuable in their lives and gave back only the cold comfort of believing their suffering had meaning. They were not examples of human achievement, but warnings about the dangers of systems that prioritize abstract ideals over human welfare. that demand perfect adherence to impossible standards, and that transform love into duty, joy into discipline, and life into a prolonged meditation on death. In the end, the story of the samurai is not a tale of honor triumphant, but of humanity defeated, not of spiritual achievement, but of psychological destruction, not of noble sacrifice, but of systematic abuse disguised as virtue. They were warriors who won every battle except the most important one, the fight to remain human in the face of dehumanizing expectations. Their tragedy was not that they failed to live up to their ideals, but that they succeeded too well, achieving a perfect conformity to standards that should never have been set for any human being. The real lesson of the samurai is not that we should admire their dedication or emulate their discipline, but that we should recognize the warning signs of systems that demand the sacrifice of our essential humanity in exchange for the promise of honor, meaning, or transcendence. The greatest honor we can give to the actual men who lived and died as samurai is to learn from their suffering, to refuse to romanticize their pain, and to commit ourselves to creating societies where human beings are valued for what they are, rather than destroyed for what they cannot become. Being a samurai was terrible, not because of the physical dangers or material hardships, but because it required the systematic elimination of everything that makes human existence worthwhile. It was a life without love, without joy, without genuine choice, without authentic connection, and without the possibility of growth or change. It was, in the truest sense, a living death endured by men who had been convinced that their death was more valuable than their life, their suffering more meaningful than their happiness, and their destruction more noble than their humanity. This is the truth behind the myth, the reality behind the romance, and the human cost of a system that transformed warriors into weapons, individuals into instruments, and human beings into hollow symbols of impossible ideals. The samurai were not heroes to be emulated, but victims to be mourned, not examples of human potential fulfilled, but warnings of human potential destroyed. Their story is not one of triumph, but of tragedy, and the greatest tragedy of all is that so few people recognize it as such.